There exists a place where the fabric between worlds grows thin as morning mist over a bog. Not a location you can mark on any map, but a condition of twilight and solitude that descends upon the Irish countryside when darkness claims the land. In these liminal hours, when the sun has abandoned the sky, but the moon has not yet risen to replace it, the rules that govern the ordinary world loosen their grip. What walks abroad in such moments does not belong to the realm of human understanding, and those who encounter it rarely speak of what they have witnessed without a tremor in their voice and a distant look in their eyes. The Folklore of Ireland is not a collection of charming bedtime stories or whimsical tales designed to entertain children. It is a survival manual written in the language of metaphor and warning, passed down through generations, who understood that the world contained forces far older and more powerful than human civilization. These stories were not told to delight, but to educate, to prepare the unwary for encounters that could cost them their sanity, their fortune, or their very lives. The creatures that populate genuine Irish mythology are not the sanitized fairies of Victorian illustration, or the mischievous sprites of modern fantasy. They are ancient, intelligent, and profoundly indifferent to human morality or suffering. Welcome to Echoes of the Old World, where we pull back the veil on folklore's most dangerous and misunderstood entities. Here, we do not soften the edges or romanticize the terror that our ancestors felt when they spoke of the other. We examine these beings as they were truly understood, as tests of character, as warnings incarnate, as the personification of fears both rational and primal. If this journey into the shadowed corners of cultural memory speaks to you, consider subscribing to join us as we explore the creatures that haunted not just the imagination, but the lived experience of those who came before us. Among the many entities that prowl the borderlands between the human world and the realm of the Fae, few inspire the particular dread reserved for the Far Darrig. His name translates from Irish Gaelic as Far Darrig, the Red Man, and unlike the countless spirits that might be appeased with offerings or avoided through knowledge of the proper rituals, the Far Darrig actively seeks out human victims for his own cruel amusement. He is not a force to be respected, nor a guardian spirit to be honored, nor even a simple malevolent entity to be feared and avoided. He is something more complex and more disturbing. A trickster who delights in psychological torture, who tests his victims not with riddles or contest of wit, but with trials designed to break the human spirit. The Far Darrig belongs to that classification of Irish supernatural beings known as the solitary fairies, entities who walk alone rather than in the troops and courts that characterize the more social fae. But even among these lone wanderers, he occupies a special category of danger. Where the Leprechaun might trick you out of your gold or lead you astray on a foggy night, the Far Darrig's games involve forcing witnesses to participate in horrific tableaux, to perform acts of desecration, to endure psychological torments that would drive lesser souls to madness. His pranks, if such a trivial word can be applied to his activities, frequently result in death, insanity, or lifelong trauma for those unfortunate enough to cross his path. Before we venture deeper into his domain and explore the specific horrors he inflicts upon the unwary, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from and whether the folklore of your own culture contains entities similar to the Far Darrig. Understanding how different cultures approach the concept of malevolent tricksters helps us see the universal human need to explain and prepare for encounters with forces beyond our control. The historical record of the Far Darrig stretches back through centuries of Irish oral tradition, particularly concentrated in the western regions of the island where the old beliefs held strongest and longest. These were not urban legends or campfire stories designed to thrill. They were solemn warnings shared among communities where everyone knew someone who claimed to have encountered the Red Man or who had witnessed the aftermath of such an encounter. The Irish Folklore Commission archives contain numerous testimonies from the 19th and early 20th centuries, recorded from individuals who swore to the truth of their accounts with the same gravity they would bring to sworn testimony in a court of law. What made these encounters particularly terrifying was their unpredictability and their purpose. The Far Darrig does not hunt for sustenance or territory. He does not kill out of anger or defend his domain from intruders. His motivation appears to be nothing more than a desire to test human beings through ordeals of the most psychologically devastating kind imaginable. He forces his victims to confront their deepest fears, to participate in acts that violate their most sacred beliefs, to maintain composure in situations designed to shatter the mind. And the rules of survival are brutally simple. Show no fear, refuse no command, maintain absolute composure no matter what horrors unfold before your eyes. Failure means death or madness. Success means merely that you survive to carry the memory of what you witnessed for the rest of your days. Understand that the Far Darrig operates in a moral framework completely alien to human ethics. He is neither evil in the sense that we understand malevolence, nor is he good in any meaningful way. He simply is, like a force of or a fundamental law of the universe. Those who study Irish folklore extensively have proposed various theories about his purpose and his place in the supernatural hierarchy. Some suggest he serves as a test of character, weeding out the weak and the cowardly. Others propose he functions as a guardian of boundaries, punishing those who venture too carelessly into liminal spaces. Still others believe he represents something more primal, the universe's indifference to human comfort, and the harsh reality that courage and composure are sometimes the only currencies that matter when facing the inexplicable. In the chapters that follow, we will examine the specific trials he inflicts upon his victims, the documented encounters recorded by collectors of folklore, and the cultural context that gave rise to such a uniquely terrifying entity. We will explore why Irish peasants developed such elaborate rules for surviving supernatural encounters, and what the Far Darrig reveals about a culture that valued stoicism and emotional control as literal survival skills. We will trace his influence through the landscape of Irish mythology and examine why, unlike many folkloric creatures that faded with modernization, the memory of the Far Darrig retains its power to disturb even today. The threshold between worlds remains thin, and the Red Man still walks the lonely roads and desolate places where twilight lingers longest. What he seeks, what drives him to inflict such calculated terror upon those he encounters, remains as mysterious now as it was to those who first warned their children to be home before dark. But the rules for survival, passed down through generations of whispered warnings and solemn testimony, remain clear. If you encounter the Far Darrig, show no fear, refuse no command, and pray that your composure holds until he releases you from his game. Your life, your sanity, and your soul depend upon it. If you were to encounter the Far Darrig on a lonely road at dusk, your first impression might be one of curious relief rather than terror. From a distance, he appears almost mundane, a small figure wrapped in distinctive red garments, walking with purpose along the roadside, or standing motionless at a crossroads. Your initial assessment might categorize him as merely an oddly dressed traveler, perhaps a wandering tinker, or an eccentric hermit making his way between villages. This moment of misidentification, this brief window where your mind struggles to reconcile what your eyes perceive with what your instincts whisper, represents the last seconds of normalcy before you understand the true of what stands before you. The Far Darrig stands no taller than a child of 10 or 12 years. Though his proportions are distinctly adult and his bearing carries an authority that no human child could possibly possess. His most striking feature, the characteristic that gives him his name, is the long red coat that drapes his small frame like a ceremonial robe. This garment is not the bright, cheerful red of celebration or festival, but rather a deeper, more troubling shade that historical accounts struggle to describe with precision. Some witnesses have called it the red of rust or dried clay, others the red of autumn leaves moments before they fall and rot. The coat itself appears aged beyond measure, its fabric worn smooth in some places and threadbare in others, suggesting centuries of wear rather than mere decades. Beneath this red coat, he wears additional layers of similarly coloured clothing, breeches, a waistcoat, stockings that disappear into small pointed shoes. Every element of his attire maintains this same unsettling red hue, creating a figure that seems to have been dipped entirely in a single colour, as if the universe decided to mark him as fundamentally different from the natural world. Upon his head sits a red cap or hood, pulled low over his features in a way that casts his face into shadow even on the brightest days. This deliberate concealment serves a purpose beyond mere fashion or comfort. It creates a pocket of darkness where his face should be, a void that draws the eye while simultaneously resisting clear observation. When he does reveal his features, either by tilting his head or removing his cap entirely, what emerges from that shadow is perhaps more disturbing than any monstrous visage could be. His face is that of an old man, weathered by time and marked by age, in a way that suggests not just years but centuries of existence. A long grey beard flows from his chin, contrasting starkly with the red of his garments and adding to the overall impression of something ancient and enduring. His features, when visible, appear human enough in their basic configuration. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth arranged in the familiar pattern. But there is something fundamentally wrong in the proportions, in the angles, in the way light falls across his countenance that triggers a deep primal alarm in any human observer. The eyes are what betray his true most completely. They possess a quality that multiple witnesses across centuries have struggled to articulate in their testimonies. They are not the warm, living eyes of a human being, regardless of how old or weathered. They are not even the alien, but comprehensible eyes of an animal going about its business in the natural world. They are something else entirely, ancient beyond measure, intelligent in ways that have nothing to do with human cognition, and utterly devoid of anything resembling human empathy or compassion. To meet those eyes is to understand in a single moment of terrible clarity that you are in the presence of something that existed long before your ancestors first lit fires in caves, and will continue to exist long after your descendants have turned to dust. Historical accounts from the Irish countryside provide remarkably consistent descriptions of the Far Darrig's appearance, despite coming from different regions and different time periods. This consistency suggests either a genuine phenomenon being observed and reported with accuracy, or a cultural archetype so deeply embedded in the Irish consciousness that it manifests uniformly across geographical and temporal boundaries. Witnesses describe his movements as peculiar, neither quite human nor quite animal in their rhythm and flow. He walks with a gait that seems slightly wrong, as if his joints bend at angles that human anatomy does not permit, or as if gravity affects him differently than it does the natural world around him. His voice, when he chooses to speak, carries qualities that further establish his otherworldly. It is neither high nor low, neither loud nor soft, but rather seems to exist at precisely the frequency needed to command absolute attention while simultaneously creating profound unease. The Irish language contains words to describe the particular quality of supernatural voices, terms that have no direct translation into English but convey the idea of sound that comes from no human throat. The Far Darrig's speech patterns follow the formal, archaic structures of very old Irish, the language as it was spoken centuries ago, marking him as something that predates modern linguistic evolution. What makes encountering the Far Darrig particularly unsettling is this very quality of being almost, but not quite human in appearance. Our brains are exquisitely tuned to recognize human faces and forms, to extract meaning from tiny variations in expression and posture. When presented with something that resembles a human, but violates the subtle rules of human appearance and movement, the result is a profound cognitive dissonance that manifests as visceral dread. This is not the clean fear inspired by an obvious monster or predator. This is the deeper, more disturbing recognition that something is pretending to be human, or was perhaps human once, but has been transformed into something else entirely. The time and place of Far Darrig encounters follow predictable patterns that suggest deliberate choice rather than random chance. He appears most frequently at twilight, that liminal hour when day surrenders to night and the world exists in a state of transition. He favors crossroads, those places where multiple paths intersect and choices must be made, locations that Irish folklore has long recognized as holding particular supernatural significance. He is drawn to lonely stretches of road where a traveler might walk for miles without encountering another human soul, where help is distant and witnesses are absent. These choices of time and location are not accidental, but rather reveal a predatory intelligence that understands isolation and vulnerability. The seasonality of encounters also shows patterns worthy of note. The Far Darrig walks most frequently during the darker months of the year, when night claims the majority of each 24-hour cycle and the boundaries between worlds grow thin. Late autumn and winter, when the Irish landscape turns grey and barren, when mist rises from the bogs and rain falls in endless sheets, these are his preferred seasons for walking abroad. The long summer nights, when daylight lingers late and community gatherings keep people out and active, see far fewer reported encounters. He is a creature of darkness, cold, and solitude, thriving in conditions that force humans to hurry home and bolt their doors against the night. Understanding the Far Darrig's appearance is crucial because recognition is the first step in survival. If you can identify him before he initiates his test, before he speaks or makes his demands, you have gained precious seconds to prepare yourself mentally for what is to come. The old wisdom passed down through generations of Irish families emphasized the importance of knowing the signs. A small figure in red on a lonely road at twilight, the peculiar gait, the shadowed face, the ancient eyes. These are not mere curiosities to be noted and discussed later. They are warnings that demand immediate and complete attention. Because what follows recognition is the test itself, and in that test, your life or your sanity hangs in the balance. The word fairy conjures specific images in the modern imagination. Delicate winged creatures flitting through moonlit gardens, benevolent godmothers granting wishes, tiny beings who reward kindness and punish greed with poetic justice. This sanitized version of fairy lore, popularized by Victorian storytellers and perpetuated by contemporary fantasy, bears almost no resemblance to the entities that populate authentic Irish folklore. The fairies of Ireland, known collectively as the Owl Sea, or simply the Seed Hay, represent something far more complex, dangerous, and morally ambiguous than their diminutive, glittering counterparts in children's literature. To understand the Far Darrig and the unique terror he inspires, we must first understand the broader landscape of Irish supernatural beings and where he fits within that ancient hierarchy. Irish fairy lore divides these entities into two broad categories: the trooping fairies and the solitary fairies. The trooping fairies travel in groups, maintain courts and kingdoms beneath hollow hills, and observe elaborate social structures that mirror and mock human civilization. They hold processions on certain nights of the year, wage wars among themselves, and occasionally interact with human communities through bargains, exchanges, or abductions. These are the beings most commonly referenced when people speak of fairy kingdoms, or the other world as a parallel realm. While they can be dangerous, particularly when offended or trespassed against, they operate according to rules that humans can learn and, with great care, navigate. The solitary fairies, by contrast, walk alone through the Irish landscape, each pursuing their own inscrutable purposes with little regard for the social structures of either fairy or human worlds. This category encompasses a wide range of beings, from the relatively benign to the absolutely lethal, each with their own particular domain, rules of engagement, and relationship to human affairs. The leprechaun belongs to this classification, as does the banshee, the puka, the dullahan, and our subject, the Far Darrig. Understanding the hierarchy and relationships among these solitary beings is crucial to grasping why the Far Darrig occupies such a unique position in the pantheon of things to be feared. Consider the leprechaun, perhaps the most internationally recognised of all Irish fairy beings, whose image has been commercialised and trivialised to the point of cultural caricature. In authentic Irish folklore, the leprechaun is indeed a solitary fairy, a cobbler who works alone and guards his pot of gold with cunning and trickery. But his tricks, while frustrating and occasionally costly to those who encounter him, rarely result in death or permanent harm. The leprechaun operates on principles of fair exchange and clever wordplay. If you catch him, he must grant you wishes or reveal the location of his treasure, but he will use every trick of language and distraction to escape your grasp. His pranks might leave you wandering lost until dawn or chasing illusions across the countryside, but they are fundamentally games with rules that both parties understand. The leprechaun represents what we might call the mischievous tier of fairy beings. Troublesome, certainly, prone to causing inconvenience and frustration, but ultimately survivable for the average human who encounters one. He might steal your tools or lead your livestock astray or cause your milk to sour, but he will not drive you mad. He will not kill you, and he will not force you to participate in psychological torments designed to break your spirit. His motivation appears to be a combination of protecting his treasure and simple amusement at human frustration. There is almost something playful about him, despite his cunning and his refusal to simply hand over his gold to anyone who demands it. The Far Darrig, while classified in the same broad category of solitary fairies, operates on an entirely different moral and motivational plane. Where the leprechaun's tricks are annoying but ultimately harmless, the Far Darrig's tests are specifically designed to traumatize, to push the human psyche to its absolute breaking point. Where the leprechaun seeks to protect what is his and perhaps derive some entertainment from human greed, the Far Darrig actively seeks out victims for the express purpose of inflicting psychological torture. Where the leprechaun will eventually let you go, frustrated but unharmed, the Far Darrig's games end in madness or death for those who fail his tests. This is not mischief. This is malevolence of a particularly calculated and cruel variety. The distinction becomes even clearer when we examine other members of the solitary fairy classification. The banshee, despite her terrifying appearance and bone-chilling wail, does not actually harm humans. She is an omen, a messenger of approaching death, but not death's instrument. She appears to warn certain Irish families of impending loss, and while her presence is deeply unsettling and her cry induces profound dread, she is ultimately fulfilling a function that some might even consider compassionate in its way. She gives families time to prepare, to gather, to say goodbye. Her motivation is tied to ancient bonds between families and their supernatural watchers, not to any desire to cause suffering. The puka represents another point on this spectrum of fairy danger. This shape-shifting entity can appear as a horse, goat, dog, or various other forms, and delights in taking humans on wild, terrifying rides through the countryside. The puka's tricks are physically dangerous and genuinely frightening, but they serve a purpose beyond mere cruelty. Many Irish stories suggest the puka tests courage and humility, that those who treat the creature with respect and show no fear may even receive blessings or warnings in return. There is an exchange happening, a relationship being negotiated, even if it is a relationship between wildly unequal parties. The puka operates within a framework of traditional rural wisdom. Respect the unknown, maintain your composure, and you might survive with something gained rather than something lost. The Far Darrig fits into none of these more understandable categories. He is not protecting territory like some fairy beings. He is not delivering messages or serving as an omen. He is not even testing courage in the straightforward manner of the puka's wild rides. Instead, he forces his victims to participate in elaborate scenarios of horror that serve no purpose other than to see whether they will break under the psychological pressure. He makes them witness false resurrections, cook illusory corpses, dig up graves, all while knowing that the slightest display of fear or horror will result in their death or madness. This is not mischief, not even in the darkest sense. This is systematic psychological warfare waged against random victims for reasons that remain opaque even to those who study Irish folklore most intensively. What makes this classification significant is what it reveals about Irish cultural understanding of the supernatural world. The Irish did not view all fairy beings as equally dangerous, nor did they lump them together into simple categories of good and evil. They maintained a sophisticated taxonomy that recognized gradations of danger, different types of relationships between humans and the supernatural, and varying levels of malevolence or benevolence. This nuanced understanding was not academic but practical, a survival guide for navigating a world where the supernatural was considered as real and present as the physical landscape. The fact that the Far Darrig occupies the absolute extreme end of this spectrum, that he represents the most dangerous and malevolent category of solitary fairy, tells us something important about what the Irish considered truly terrifying. It was not physical danger alone, not the threat of being eaten or killed outright. Many fairy beings could kill you if they chose. What made the Far Darrig uniquely terrifying was the psychological dimension of his torments, the way he forced his victims to participate in their own trauma, to maintain impossible composure while witnessing unspeakable things. This suggests a culture that understood psychological torture as perhaps the deepest and most lasting form of harm one being could inflict upon another. When we speak of the Far Darrig, then, we are not speaking of just another fairy tale creature or a variant on the common trickster archetype. We are speaking of something the Irish considered fundamentally different and infinitely more dangerous than the leprechauns, banshees, and pukas that populate their rich folklore tradition. He stands alone in his category, a being whose very existence serves as a warning about the darkest possibilities of the supernatural world and the extreme psychological resilience required to survive an encounter with forces that view human suffering as nothing more than an entertaining test of character. The cemetery at midnight is a place that exists outside the normal flow of time and human comfort. Ancient headstones lean at angles that defy geometry, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain until the names of the dead have become nothing more than suggestions in weathered stone. Mist rises from the earth itself, coiling between monuments like the breath of something vast and sleeping just beneath the surface. The silence here is not merely the absence of sound, but rather a presence of its own, a weight that presses against your ears and makes even your own breathing seem like a violation of some unspoken rule. This is the stage the Far Darrig chooses for one of his most psychologically devastating tests. And if you find yourself in such a place at such an hour with the red man standing beside you, you will need every ounce of courage and composure you possess to survive what comes next. The tale comes to us from County Galway, recorded in the mid-19th century from a farmer named Seamus, who swore to its truth until his dying day. He had been returning home late from market, his pockets heavy with the coins from a successful day of selling livestock, his mind occupied with plans for the coming season. The sun had set hours earlier, and the road stretched before him in darkness, broken only by starlight and the occasional glimpse of moon through racing clouds. It was at a crossroads, naturally, that he encountered the small figure in red standing motionless in the center of the intersection. As if he had been waiting for Seamus specifically, as if this meeting had been arranged by forces far older than human commerce or agricultural seasons. Seamus recognized what stood before him immediately. The old knowledge passed down through his family had prepared him for this possibility, though no amount of preparation can truly ready a person for the reality of facing the Far Darrig. The creature regarded him with those ancient, inhuman eyes and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The command was simple and absolute. Seamus was to accompany the Far Darrig to the old cemetery on the hill, and there he was, to witness something and maintain perfect composure throughout, no matter what he saw or heard. Refusal was not an option. Fear was not permitted. The rules were laid out with terrible clarity, and Seamus understood that his life depended entirely on his ability to control his reactions to whatever horror the Far Darrig had planned. They walked together through the darkness, the small red figure leading the way, with steps that made no sound on the dirt road, while Seamus followed behind, his heart hammering in his chest but his face carefully neutral. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to abandon the road and flee across the fields, to seek the safety of his home and bolt the door against the night. But he knew, with the certainty that comes from generations of accumulated wisdom, that running would mean death. The Far Darrig does not chase those who flee. He simply ends them where they stand, their hearts stopping mid-stride, their bodies found the next morning with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. So Seamus walked, controlling his breathing, maintaining his composure, preparing himself mentally for whatever trial awaited him among the graves. The cemetery gates stood open as if expecting their arrival, the iron hinges making no sound as they passed through into the grounds beyond. The Far Darrig led Seamus to the oldest section of the burial ground, where monuments dated back centuries and the names of the dead belonged to families long extinct. He stopped before a particular grave, its stone marker cracked and tilted, moss covering whatever inscription might once have identified the person buried beneath. The Far Darrig turned to face Seamus and spoke again in that voice that demanded obedience. He was to watch and to remain completely still and silent, no matter what transpired. Any sound, any movement born of fear or revulsion would be interpreted as failure. And failure meant forfeiting his life or his sanity to the red man's cruel amusement. What happened next exists at the boundary between the possible and the impossible, between the natural world and whatever realm the Far Darrig truly inhabits. The earth above the grave began to move, not with the slow settling of soil, but with deliberate purpose, as if something beneath was pushing upward toward the surface. The ground bulged and cracked, clods of dirt falling away to reveal what appeared to be a pale hand emerging from the depths. Seamus stood frozen, not from obedience to the Far Darrig's command, but from sheer paralysis at witnessing the fundamental rules of death and burial being violated before his eyes. The hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, then the slow emergence of what appeared to be a corpse pulling itself from the grave with mechanical, unnatural movements. The figure that emerged bore all the signs of death and decay that one would expect from something long buried. The clothes hung in rotted tatters, The exposed skin showed the mottled discoloration of advanced decomposition, and the movements were jerky and wrong, as if the body no longer remembered quite how living muscles and joints were supposed to function. It pulled itself fully from the earth and stood swaying in the moonlight, its head hanging at an angle that suggested a broken neck, its arms dangling loosely at its sides. Then, with horrible deliberation, it began to walk, stumbling between the headstones in a grotesque parody of life, moving closer and closer to where Seamus stood rooted to the spot. Every fibre of Seamus's being screamed at him to run, to look away, to cry out in horror at this violation of the natural order. The thing shambling toward him represented every fear humans harbour about death and what comes after. Every nightmare about the boundary between life and death becoming permeable. But Seamus remembered the rules. He remembered the warnings passed down through his family. He understood that this was the test, that the Far Darrig was watching him with those ancient eyes, measuring his reactions, waiting for the slightest sign of fear or weakness that would justify the terrible punishment that awaited those who failed. So he stood his ground, forcing his face into neutrality, controlling his breathing despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm his composure. The walking corpse approached to within arm's length, close enough that Seamus could see details he would carry in his nightmares for the rest of his life. It reached out with one decayed hand as if to touch him, and in that moment, Seamus faced the ultimate test of his courage and self-control. He did not flinch. He did not step back. He did not make any sound or show any reaction whatsoever, though inside his mind screamed and his soul recoiled from what stood before him. The corpse's hand stopped inches from his face, hovering in the air for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, with the same jerky, unnatural movements, it withdrew, turned, and stumbled back toward the open grave from which it had emerged. The figure descended back into the earth, the soil flowing back into place as if it had never been disturbed, until nothing remained but the weathered headstone and the moss-covered ground. The Far Darrig turned his ancient gaze from the grave to Seamus, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he spoke. His words conveyed neither approval nor disappointment, simply acknowledgement that Seamus had passed the test by maintaining his composure throughout the horrific display. The red man then vanished, not walking away, but simply ceasing to exist in that location, leaving Seamus alone in the cemetery with his racing heart and the memory of what he had witnessed. Seamus walked home that night, a changed man. He'd survived an encounter with the Far Darrig, had passed the test of the false resurrection, but the price of survival was the permanent knowledge of what he had seen. For the rest of his life, he would know with absolute certainty that the boundaries between life and death, between the natural and supernatural worlds, were far thinner and more permeable than comfortable human philosophy would prefer to believe. He would carry the memory of that walking corpse, the sound of earth moving against natural law, the terrible closeness of that decayed hand reaching toward his face. He had maintained his composure, had controlled his fear, had survived where so many others had failed. But survival did not mean forgetting, and the Far Darrig's tests leave marks on the psyche that no amount of time can fully erase. This particular test, the false resurrection, appears repeatedly in Irish folklore, accounts of Far Darrig encounters. The specifics vary from telling to telling. Sometimes the corpse speaks, sometimes multiple bodies emerge from their graves, sometimes the victim is commanded to assist in the resurrection rather than merely witness it, but the core elements remain constant: the midnight cemetery, the violation of death's finality, the absolute requirement that the victim show no fear or horror regardless of what unfolds before their eyes. The psychological sophistication of this test cannot be overstated. The the Far Darrig understands exactly which buttons to push in the human psyche, which fundamental fears to exploit, which boundaries to violate, to create maximum psychological impact, while still maintaining the structure of a test that can theoretically be passed through sheer force of will and emotional control. Among all the tests the Far Darrig inflicts upon his chosen victims, none strikes deeper into the human soul than the ordeal of the cooking pot. This particular trial represents the apex of psychological warfare, a scenario so carefully designed to violate every instinct of human decency and compassion, that even hearing the story secondhand can induce a visceral sense of horror and dread. The test exploits the deepest wells of human empathy and protective instinct, forcing the victim to choose between following commands that seem to demand participation in ultimate evil or refusing and facing certain death. It is cruelty refined to its purest form, horror distilled into a single impossible choice. The account comes from the oral tradition of County Mayo, passed down through multiple generations before being recorded by folklore collectors in the late 1800s. A man named Patrick, a bachelor farmer living alone in a remote cottage at the edge of the boglands, encountered the Far Darrig on a winter evening as darkness fell early and complete. Patrick had been returning from checking his sheep when he found the small, red-clad figure standing in the path that led to his door, as if the entity had been waiting specifically for him, as if this meeting had been arranged by forces Patrick could neither understand nor resist. The Far Darrig spoke with that voice that permits no disobedience, commanding Patrick to return to his cottage and prepare his cooking fire, for they had work to do together that night. Patrick's cottage was typical of its time and place, a single room with a central hearth, sparse furniture worn smooth by generations of use, walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the Atlantic winds that howled across the bog. The Far Darrig followed him inside without invitation, his presence somehow making the familiar space feel alien and threatening, as if the simple domesticity of the cottage had been invaded by something that had no business in human dwellings. He directed Patrick to build up the fire until it blazed hot and bright, to fill the large iron cooking pot with water and set it over the flames, to prepare everything as if for a substantial meal. Patrick obeyed, moving through these familiar domestic tasks with hands that trembled slightly but a face that remained carefully neutral, already understanding that whatever came next would test him in ways he could barely imagine. When the water in the pot had reached a rolling boil, steam rising in clouds toward the thatched roof, the Far Darrig produced from beneath his red coat what appeared to be a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He placed this bundle on Patrick's rough wooden table and slowly, deliberately unwrapped it to reveal what seemed to be the body of a young child, pale and still, eyes closed as if in sleep or death. The sight struck Patrick like a physical blow, every protective instinct he possessed screaming at him to snatch up the small form and shield it from whatever horror the Far Darrig intended. But he remained frozen, remembering the rules, understanding that any display of emotion or any attempt to interfere would mean his own death. The Far Darrig's command came with terrible clarity. Patrick was to take the child's body and place it in the boiling pot, to cook it as he would cook any meat for his table, and to maintain absolute composure throughout the entire process. He was not to hesitate, not to show horror or revulsion, not to display any emotion whatsoever regarding the task he had been commanded to perform. Any sign of weakness, any indication that he was disturbed by what he was being forced to do, would result in immediate and fatal consequences. The test was laid out before him with brutal simplicity. Participate in what appeared to be an act of ultimate evil, or die refusing. Patrick stood at a crossroads of the soul that transcends any physical location. Every fiber of his moral being rebelled against what he was being commanded to do. The very thought of harming a child, even one who appeared already dead, violated the deepest principles of human decency and compassion. To place that small form into boiling water, to treat it as nothing more than meat for cooking, represented a desecration of everything sacred, a crossing of boundaries that no decent person could contemplate without profound horror. Yet he understood with terrible clarity that this was precisely the point of the test, that the Far Darrig had chosen this particular scenario because it was designed to be psychologically unbearable. The key to understanding Patrick's response lies in recognizing that he knew, on some level, that what lay before him could not be real. The Far Darrig was known throughout Irish folklore as a master of illusion, an entity capable of creating scenes and scenarios so convincing that victims could not distinguish them from reality. The child on the table, however real it appeared, however perfectly it mimicked the weight and temperature and appearance of an actual body, was almost certainly nothing more than an elaborate magical construct designed to provoke exactly the horror and moral revulsion that Patrick was struggling to control. But knowing intellectually that something is likely an illusion does not prevent the emotional and instinctive responses that the illusion is designed to trigger. Patrick made his choice. He approached the table with steps that felt like walking through deep water, every movement requiring conscious effort against the resistance of his own conscience and compassion. He lifted the bundle, noting with a detached part of his mind how perfectly it mimicked the weight and feel of an actual child's body, how the Far Darrig's magic extended even to these minute details designed to make the illusion as convincing and horrifying as possible. He moved toward the cooking pot with its rolling boil and rising steam, holding the bundle at arm's length, his face a mask of forced neutrality that concealed the screaming horror of his internal state. The moment he lowered the bundle toward the boiling water, something remarkable occurred. The instant before it would have touched the surface, the illusion shattered like broken glass. The bundle in his hands transformed, revealing itself to be nothing more than an old piece of sacking stuffed with straw and wool, the kind of makeshift doll that farm children might fashion from scraps. The water in the pot, which moments before had been boiling vigorously enough to fill the cottage with steam, now sat perfectly still and cool, as if it had never been heated at all. The entire scenario, crafted with such meticulous attention to detail that it had seemed absolutely real, dissolved into nothingness, leaving Patrick standing with a handful of rags and the knowledge that he had been willing to follow the command rather than show fear. The Far Darrig regarded Patrick with those ancient, unreadable eyes, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, something that might have been approval flickered across his weathered features. Patrick had passed the test not because he was willing to commit atrocity, but because he had maintained his composure even when commanded to perform an act that violated his deepest moral principles. He had understood, consciously or unconsciously, that the test was not about the action itself, but about his ability to control his fear and revulsion in the face of the seemingly impossible situation. He had recognized that in the world of fairy encounters, showing fear or breaking composure was more dangerous than following even the most horrific commands, because those commands were likely illusory, while the consequences of failure were absolutely real. The Far Darrig departed without further comment, vanishing from the cottage as mysterious as he had appeared, leaving Patrick alone with his racing heart and the memory of what he had been prepared to do in order to survive. In the days and weeks that followed, Patrick struggled to reconcile his actions with his moral sense of self. He had been willing, at least outwardly, to participate in something unconscionable. The fact that it had been an illusion, that no actual harm had occurred, did little to ease the psychological burden of having made that choice. of having demonstrated that survival instinct could override even the most fundamental moral prohibitions, when the alternative was certain death. This particular test appears in multiple variations throughout Irish folklore, each version sharing the core elements while differing in specific details. Sometimes the victim is commanded to eat the illusory flesh rather than merely cook it. Sometimes the scenario involves multiple children or other variations designed to maximize psychological impact. But the fundamental structure remains constant. The Far Darrig forces his victim to choose between participating in apparent atrocity or refusing and facing immediate death, all while maintaining perfect emotional control. The sophistication of this psychological torture cannot be overstated. It targets the very foundations of human morality and compassion, creating a scenario where every decent instinct screams for one course of action, while survival demands another. What the test reveals about Irish cultural values is perhaps as significant as the test itself. The fact that Patrick is considered to have passed, that his willingness to follow commands even when they seemed morally monstrous is treated as the correct response, tells us something profound about how Irish folklore understood the relationship between humans and the supernatural world. In that relationship, emotional control and composure were valued above moral absolutes, because the supernatural operated according to rules that had nothing to do with human ethics. The ability to maintain one's composure in the face of the impossible, to control one's reactions, even when witnessing or being commanded to participate in horror, was considered a survival skill more valuable than rigid adherence to moral principles that the fairy world neither recognized nor respected. The burial ground holds a sacred place in Irish consciousness that transcends simple religious observance or cultural tradition. It represents the final resting place of ancestors, the physical location where the community's past remains anchored to the land, where the boundary between memory and presence grows thin enough that the dead seem almost within reach of the living. To disturb a grave, to violate the sanctity of that final rest, constitutes one of the most profound taboos in Irish culture. An act that carries implications far beyond mere disrespect for the deceased. It is a desecration of the contract between past and present, a violation of the fundamental order that keeps the dead in their realm and the living in theirs. Understanding this cultural context makes the Far Darrig's obsession with forcing victims to dig up graves and disturb the dead all the more psychologically devastating. The tradition of grave-related tests appears throughout documented encounters with the Far Darrig, suggesting that this particular form of trial holds special significance in his repertoire of psychological torments. These are not simple tasks of physical labor, though the work itself is certainly grueling and exhausting. They are carefully constructed scenarios designed to force victims into direct confrontation with their deepest fears about death, decay, and the violation of sacred boundaries. The Far Darrig understands that commanding someone to dig up a grave attacks multiple layers of human psychology simultaneously. The physical revulsion at handling decayed remains, the spiritual terror of disturbing the dead, the social shame of committing an act considered utterly taboo, and the existential dread that comes from being forced to confront mortality in its most visceral form. One particularly detailed account comes from the Aran Islands, that remote archipelago off the western coast where Irish traditions remain strong well into the modern era. A fisherman named Colum encountered the Far Darrig on a night when storm clouds obscured the moon and rain fell in sheets that turned the island paths into rivers of mud. The red man appeared without warning on the path to the old graveyard, his distinctive coat somehow remaining dry despite the downpour, his ancient eyes glowing with something that might have been anticipation, or might simply have been the reflection of distant lightning. he commanded Colum to follow him to the cemetery and there to perform a task that would test whether Colum possessed the courage and composure necessary to survive the encounter. The graveyard on the Aran Islands occupies one of the most desolate and windswept locations imaginable, perched on rocky ground where soil is scarce, and graves must be dug into earth, carried to the island basket by basket over generations. The stones marking the dead lean at angles determined by wind and time, their inscriptions in Irish Gaelic speaking of families that have fished these waters since before written records began. In this place of profound ancestral significance, the Far Darrig led Colum to a specific grave, one marked by a stone so weathered that the name had become illegible, though local memory held that it marked the resting place of a fisherman who had drowned in a winter storm 3 generations earlier. The command was brutally direct. Colum was to dig up this grave, to excavate through the rocky soil until he reached whatever remained of the coffin and its contents. And throughout this entire process, he was to show no fear, no revulsion, no hesitation whatsoever. Any sign that the task disturbed him, any indication that he found the work morally or spiritually troubling, would result in his immediate death or descent into madness. The Far Darrig provided a spade worn smooth by use, as if this same tool had been employed for similar tasks countless times before, and then he stepped back to observe. Those ancient eyes fixed on Colum with an intensity that made clear that every shovelful of earth, every moment of the ordeal, was being evaluated and judged. Colum began to dig, driving the spade into earth that resisted every thrust with the stubbornness of stone and clay mixed together over decades of settlement. The rain continued to fall, turning the excavated soil into thick mud that clung to the spade and made each shovelful heavier than the last. The physical exhaustion of the work was compounded by the psychological burden of what he was doing. The knowledge that with each spade of earth removed, he was coming closer to violating the rest of someone who had lived and died and been laid to rest by grieving family members who never imagined their ancestor would be disturbed in this manner. But Colum maintained his composure, forcing his face into neutrality, controlling his breathing despite the exertion and the horror, understanding that survival depended entirely on his ability to treat this desecration as nothing more than routine labor. As the hole deepened and Colum descended into the earth itself, standing in the grave he was excavating, the psychological pressure intensified beyond anything he had experienced before. The walls of earth rose around him like the walls of his own future grave, a visceral reminder of mortality that few living people ever experience so directly. The smell of damp earth filled his nostrils, and with it came other smells, subtler but unmistakable, that suggested he was approaching the level where organic matter had slowly returned to the soil over the course of decades. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to climb out of this hole and flee into the storm, to choose any fate other than continuing to dig toward the remains of the dead. But he remembered the rules, remembered the warnings, and he continued to work. The spade struck something solid with a hollow thud that echoed in the confined space of the grave. Colum had reached the coffin, or what remained of it after years of burial in damp earth. The wood had rotted to the consistency of thick paper, collapsing inward in places and held together more by the pressure of surrounding soil than by any structural integrity of its own. The Far Darrig's voice came from above, commanding Colum to clear away the remaining earth, to expose the coffin fully, to open it and verify its contents. Each new command pushed the boundaries of what could be endured, each step of the process designed to test whether Colum's composure would finally crack under the accumulating psychological weight. Colum cleared the earth with hands that trembled slightly, but a face that remained carefully neutral. He exposed the coffin lid, its surface mottled with decay and embedded with small stones from the surrounding soil. He placed his hands on the wood, feeling it soft and yielding under his fingers, knowing that the slightest pressure would cause it to collapse inward. And at that precise moment, with his hands on the coffin and his composure stretched to its absolute breaking point, the Far Darrig called an end to the test. The command came to stop, to climb from the grave, to leave the coffin unopened and the dead undisturbed. Colm had passed by, demonstrating his willingness to follow commands to their ultimate conclusion, by maintaining composure even when asked to perform the most taboo act imaginable in his culture. As Colm climbed from the grave on legs that barely supported him, exhausted from labour and from the psychological toll of what he had been prepared to do, the Far Darrig regarded him with those unreadable ancient eyes. No words of praise or acknowledgement were offered, simply a nod that seemed to convey both dismissal and a kind of cold respect. Then the Red Man vanished into the storm, leaving Colm alone in the graveyard with an open grave that he would have to fill again before morning, lest the community discover what had occurred and ask questions that he could never truthfully answer. The physical work of refilling the grave was nothing compared to what he had already endured, but it provided time for him to process what had happened and understand the full implications of having passed the Far Darrig's test. The grave opening test reveals several crucial aspects of how the Far Darrig operates and what he represents in Irish folklore. First, it demonstrates his intimate knowledge of cultural taboos and his willingness to exploit them for maximum psychological impact. He does not simply test courage in the abstract, but rather forces victims to confront the specific boundaries and prohibitions that their culture holds most sacred. Second, it shows the sophistication of his psychological manipulation, the way he structures tests to create accumulating pressure that builds toward a breaking point most people cannot withstand. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it reveals that the test is not ultimately about the action itself, but about the victim's ability to control their emotional response to that action. The frequency with which grave-related trials appear in Far Darrig accounts suggests that Irish culture saw the desecration of burial sites as perhaps the ultimate test of composure and courage. It combined physical danger, since disturbing graves at night in isolated locations exposed victims to natural hazards as well as supernatural ones, with profound psychological and spiritual dread. The test asked victims to violate their deepest cultural programming, to commit acts that their entire upbringing had taught them to view with horror and revulsion, and to do so while maintaining perfect emotional control. Those who succeeded demonstrated not just physical courage, but a kind of psychological flexibility that could separate survival requirements from moral or cultural conditioning, at least temporarily and under extreme duress. The Far Darrig's tests are structured with brutal clarity. Maintain perfect composure throughout the ordeal. Follow every command without hesitation. Show no fear regardless of what horrors unfold before your eyes. These rules are simple enough to understand, yet nearly impossible to follow when confronted with scenarios designed specifically to shatter human psychological defenses. But what happens to those who fail? What becomes of the victims who cannot control their terror, who flinch at the crucial moment, who refuse commands that seem to demand participation in ultimate evil? The consequences of failure are as varied as they are terrible, and understanding them is crucial to comprehending why Irish communities treated Far Darrig encounters with such grave seriousness, and why the warnings about maintaining composure were passed down through generations with the weight of life or death importance. The most immediate and merciful fate, if mercy can be found in any of the Far Darrig's punishments is sudden death. Those who break down completely during the test, who scream or flee or collapse in terror, often simply die where they stand. Their hearts stop beating, their breath ceases, and they fall to the ground as if struck by lightning or seized by a fatal stroke. These deaths leave no marks of violence, no evidence of external cause, nothing that a coroner or physician examining the body could identify as the mechanism of death. The victims appear to have simply ceased living, as if some essential spark that maintains life was extinguished by an invisible hand. Irish folklore records numerous accounts of individuals found dead on lonely roads or in isolated places, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, their bodies showing no signs of injury or natural disease that could explain their demise. These sudden deaths, while tragic and terrifying to those who discovered the bodies, were considered the better outcome compared to what awaited those who failed the test in less complete ways. A victim who maintained some degree of composure but showed flickers of fear at crucial moments, who hesitated before following commands, or whose mask of neutrality slipped for just an instant, might be condemned to something far worse than quick death. Madness was the Far Darrig's preferred punishment for those who fell into this middle category of failure, and the specific of that madness was as carefully crafted as the tests themselves. This was not the random confusion or deterioration of mind that sometimes afflicts the elderly or the brain damaged. This was targeted, purposeful insanity designed to trap the victim in endless reliving of the trauma they had experienced. The Irish Folklore Commission archives contain heartbreaking testimony about individuals who survived Far Darrig encounters physically, but lost their minds in the process. These unfortunate souls would wake screaming in the night, reliving the horrors they had witnessed with such vivid intensity that family members sleeping in the same room could hear them describing scenes in agonizing detail. During waking hours, they would fall into trances without warning, their eyes fixed on something invisible to others, their hands moving through the motions of digging graves or handling corpses that existed only in their fractured perception. Some became unable to distinguish between the illusions they had been forced to witness and actual reality, treating everyday objects and people as if they were the nightmarish constructs of the Far Darrig's tests. What made this form of madness particularly cruel was its specificity and permanence. Unlike other forms of mental illness that might wax and wane with time or treatment, the insanity inflicted by the Far Darrig showed no improvement over the years. Victims might live for decades after their encounter, but they would spend those decades trapped in the moment of their failure, unable to escape the psychological loop created by the trauma. Family members reported that speaking to these individuals was like speaking to someone who existed simultaneously in two times and places: the present moment and the night of their encounter with the Red Man. They would respond to questions about ordinary matters while simultaneously reacting to horrors that no one else could see, creating conversations that were heartbreaking in their demonstration of a mind irrevocably fractured. A particularly disturbing category of failure involved those who physically refused the Far Darrig's commands, who said no, or turned away, or attempted to flee before the test had truly begun. These individuals faced punishments that combined physical suffering with psychological torment, in ways that suggested the Far Darrig possessed not just the ability to manipulate perception, but also genuine power over the physical world and the human body. Some victims developed wasting illnesses that no physician could diagnose or treat, their bodies slowly consuming themselves over months or years, while remaining stubbornly alive despite the progressive deterioration. Others experienced a cascade of misfortunes so consistent and devastating that they appeared to be suffering under a genuine curse rather than merely experiencing bad luck. These cursed individuals found that every enterprise they attempted ended in failure or disaster. Crops they planted would wither in the field even when neighboring farms flourished. Livestock they tended would sicken and die from mysterious ailments that affected no other animals in the region. Business ventures would collapse through unlikely combinations of circumstances that seemed almost deliberately orchestrated to cause maximum financial and emotional damage. Relationships would sour and fracture for reasons that participants could not fully articulate. The cumulative effect was a life that spiraled steadily downward, despite the victims' best efforts, as if they had been marked by some invisible force that ensured nothing good could take root in their existence. What distinguished these supernatural punishments from the ordinary misfortunes that afflict all human lives was their consistency, their specificity, and their clear connection to the moment of failure with the Far Darrig. Community members who witnessed these declines noted that the misfortunes always trace back to a specific night, a specific encounter, a specific moment when the victim had refused or failed the test. The timing was too precise, the pattern too consistent, the suffering too targeted to be dismissed as coincidence or natural bad luck. These were individuals who had violated the rules of engagement with the supernatural world and were paying the price for that violation in ways that served as warnings to anyone else who might contemplate similar refusal. The physical manifestations of failure extended beyond wasting illnesses and cascading misfortunes. Some victims developed conditions that modern medicine would struggle to categorize. Chronic pain with no discernible physical cause, paralysis that affected only specific limbs or functions in ways that made no anatomical sense, sensory distortions that made ordinary experiences torturous. One recorded case described a man who, after refusing to follow the Far Darrig's command to enter a cemetery, at night, found that he could no longer tolerate the sensation of darkness touching his skin. Any shadow that fell across his body caused excruciating pain, forcing him to live in perpetual illumination and making normal life effectively impossible. Another account detailed a woman who, after showing fear during a test involving the apparent resurrection of the dead, lost the ability to sleep more than a few minutes at a time for the rest of her life, condemned to decades of exhaustion and the hallucinations that inevitably accompany severe sleep deprivation. The lasting of these punishments carried profound implications for how Irish communities understood the Far Darrig and the supernatural world more broadly. These were not temporary afflictions that would heal with time or treatment. They were permanent alterations to the victim's existence, marks that could not be erased or overcome through any human means. This permanence suggested that the Far Darrig possessed authority that extended beyond simple tricks or temporary illusions. He could fundamentally change the trajectory of a human life, could impose conditions that no power on earth could reverse, could reach across the boundary between supernatural and natural worlds to inflict consequences that persisted long after the encounter itself had ended. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that there appeared to be no appeals process, no way to bargain or negotiate once the punishment had been imposed. Catholic priests might offer prayers for the afflicted. Folk healers might attempt their remedies, but nothing proved effective against the consequences of failing the Far Darrig's tests. The victims were trapped in their punishment with no hope of release or redemption, serving as living warnings to others about the absolute necessity of maintaining composure when confronted by the Red Man. Their suffering was not merely personal tragedy, but communal lesson. Their ruined lives a testament to what awaited anyone who failed to control their fear when facing the impossible. The accumulated wisdom of generations, who lived with the constant possibility of supernatural encounters, created a body of survival knowledge as sophisticated and practical as any guide for navigating physical dangers. This knowledge was not theoretical or abstract, but rather hard-won through centuries of trial, error, and tragic failure. Irish communities that maintained the old ways understood that emotional control was not merely a virtue or a sign of good character, but a literal survival skill that could mean the difference between life and death when confronting entities like the Far Darrig. The rules for surviving such encounters were passed down through families with the same gravity and importance as lessons about avoiding dangerous bogs or reading weather patterns before setting out to sea. These were not suggestions or guidelines, but absolute requirements that demanded strict adherence if one hoped to survive an encounter with the Red Man. The first and most fundamental rule, repeated in every account and warning, was to show no fear whatsoever. This requirement extended beyond merely concealing visible signs of terror to encompassing a deeper level of emotional control that approached the superhuman. The Far Darrig possessed the ability to sense fear in ways that transcended observation of physical reactions. He could detect the racing heart, the spike in body temperature, the subtle changes in scent that accompany the fear response, the almost imperceptible trembling of muscles preparing for flight. Survivors of encounters emphasized that one had to achieve genuine emotional neutrality, not merely present a brave facade while terror churned beneath the surface. This demanded a level of mental discipline that required lifelong cultivation, beginning in childhood, with exercises in composure and emotional regulation that modern psychology would recognize as advanced mindfulness practices. The second cardinal rule demanded absolute obedience to every command issued by the Far Darrig, regardless of how horrific or morally repugnant those commands might appear. This rule created profound ethical dilemmas for those who encountered the Red Man, forcing them to choose between following orders that seemed to demand participation in atrocity, or refusing and facing certain death or madness. The key to understanding this rule lay in recognizing that the Far Darrig's commands were almost always tests of composure, rather than genuine demands for action. The apparent child's body to be cooked would reveal itself as straw and rags. The corpse to be exhumed would transform into harmless matter at the crucial moment. The resurrection witnessed would dissolve into illusion once the test concluded. Irish tradition emphasized that the action itself mattered far less than the victim's ability to proceed with it while maintaining perfect emotional control. The third essential rule required understanding the precise boundaries and structure of the test. Every Far Darrig encounter followed patterns that, once recognized, provided crucial information about what was actually being evaluated. The tests always involved witnessing or participating in scenarios that violated fundamental human taboos. Desecration of the dead, apparent harm to innocents, actions that contradicted core moral principles, but they also always contained internal logic and structure that revealed them as tests rather than genuine demands for evil. Survivors who passed the trials often reported that at some level, they understood they were being tested, that the scenarios were constructed rather than real, and that maintaining composure was the actual requirement rather than completing the horrific task. This meta-awareness, the ability to recognize the test as test even while fully experiencing its horror, represented an advanced level of psychological sophistication that separated survivors from victims. The fourth rule addressed the critical importance of verbal restraint during encounters. Victims were instructed never to speak unless directly questioned, never to volunteer information or commentary, never to express opinions or reactions to what they witnessed. The Far Darrig valued silence as a form of composure, and unnecessary speech often revealed fear or discomfort the physical control might successfully conceal. Those who survived emphasized that they maintained complete silence throughout their ordeals, except when responding to direct questions. And even then they answered with the minimum words necessary to satisfy the query. This verbal discipline extended to controlling breathing, avoiding gasps or sharp intakes of breath that might signal shock or horror, maintaining respiratory patterns that suggested calm even when internal states were anything but calm. The fifth rule involved understanding the temporal structure of the tests. Far Darrig encounters had definite beginnings and endings, and victims who recognized this structure gained crucial psychological advantages. The ordeal would not continue indefinitely. There would be a moment when the test concluded and the Far Darrig either acknowledged success or imposed punishment for failure. This knowledge allowed victims to frame their experience as something to be endured rather than an endless nightmare with no conclusion. Survivors spoke of dividing their ordeals into manageable segments, focusing on maintaining composure through each phase rather than considering the experience as a whole. This psychological chunking, breaking the unbearable into smaller pieces that could individually be borne, represented a sophisticated coping mechanism that Irish tradition had codified into practical advice. The sixth rule emphasized the importance of preparation and mental rehearsal long before any actual encounter occurred. Irish families who maintained the old knowledge would regularly discuss what to do if one encountered the Far Darrig, walking children through scenarios and practicing emotional control exercises that would build the psychological muscles needed to survive such tests. These were not casual conversations, but serious training sessions that treated supernatural encounters as realistic possibilities requiring concrete preparation. Young people might be asked to maintain composure while witnessing staged scenes designed to provoke fear or revulsion, to practice following commands that felt wrong or disturbing, to develop the mental discipline that would serve them if they ever found themselves facing the Red Man on a lonely road at twilight. The seventh rule addressed the crucial period immediately following an encounter. Those who passed Far Darrig tests were instructed to maintain silence about their experiences for a specific period, typically until the next sunrise. Speaking of the encounter too soon might somehow negate the success or invite renewed attention from the entity. This enforced silence served multiple purposes. It gave victims time to process what they had experienced before attempting to communicate it to others. It prevented panic from spreading through communities. And it maintained the liminal quality of the encounter as something that existed partially outside normal time and space. Only after the sun had risen and normal reality had fully reasserted itself should survivors begin to speak of what they had endured. The eighth and perhaps most subtle rule involved understanding that acceptance of the encounter was itself a form of survival. Victims who spent precious mental energy questioning why this was happening to them, raging against the unfairness of being chosen, or attempting to negotiate or bargain with the Far Darrig inevitably failed. The entity was not interested in explanations, justifications, or appeals to mercy or justice. He simply conducted his tests according to his own inscrutable purposes, and the victim's only viable response was acceptance and focus on maintaining composure throughout. This acceptance did not mean passivity, but rather a form of active engagement with the reality of the situation as it existed, rather than as one might wish it to be. These rules, preserved and passed down through generations, represented something more than mere folklore or superstition. They constituted a sophisticated psychological survival manual designed to help ordinary people navigate encounters with entities that operated according to completely alien logic and values. The emphasis on emotional control, on understanding structure and boundaries, on preparation and mental discipline, reveals a culture that took the supernatural world seriously and developed practical strategies for surviving contact with it. The rules worked not because they provided protection in any mystical sense, but because they equipped people with the psychological tools necessary to maintain composure under extreme duress, to control their fear responses, and to function effectively even when confronting the seemingly impossible. What these survival rules ultimately reveal is that Irish tradition understood something profound about the psychological resilience and the relationship between mental discipline and physical survival. The ability to control one's emotional responses, to maintain composure in the face of horror, to follow through on commitments, even when every instinct screams for flight. These are skills that extend far beyond supernatural encounters. They are fundamental capacities that determine how individuals respond to any extreme situation, whether that situation involves facing the Far Darrig on a lonely road or confronting the various psychological challenges that life inevitably presents. The western edge of Ireland occupies a unique position in both the geography and the mythology of the island. Here, the Atlantic Ocean crashes against ancient stone cliffs with a fury that seems almost personal, as if the sea itself harbors some grudge against the land and seeks to reclaim it wave by relentless wave. The landscape is one of extremes, towering cliffs that drop hundreds of feet to churning water below, vast expanses of bog where solid ground gives way without warning, to pools of dark water concealed beneath innocent-looking moss. Stretches of limestone pavement cracked and fissured by millennia of weathering into patterns that seem almost deliberate in their geometry. This is not gentle countryside of rolling hills and pastoral valleys. This is harsh, unforgiving terrain that has shaped the people who inhabit it into resilience incarnate. And it is here, in these westernmost reaches, that the Far Darrig walks most frequently, and his presence is felt most keenly. The counties of Galway, Mayo, Clare and Kerry contain the highest concentration of Far Darrig encounters recorded in Irish folklore archives. These are not random locations, but rather specific places where the boundary between the human world and the realm of the supernatural has always been recognized as particularly thin and permeable. The reasons for this concentration are multiple and interconnected, involving geography, history, and the peculiar quality of light and atmosphere that characterizes the western coast. The constant presence of the Atlantic creates weather patterns that shift with bewildering rapidity, where brilliant sunshine can give way to impenetrable fog in minutes, where visibility drops to arm's length and familiar landmarks vanish into grey void. These sudden transformations create temporal and spatial disorientation that opens cracks in the fabric of ordinary reality. The Burren region of County Clare represents perhaps the most quintessential Far Darrig territory in all of Ireland. This vast limestone plateau, stretching across hundreds of square miles, presents landscape so alien and otherworldly that it seems to belong to some other planet rather than the familiar Earth. The stone here has been weathered into formations called clints and grikes, creating a surface that resembles a massive cobweb of cracks and fissures, where anything from delicate wildflowers to complete human bodies could disappear without trace. Walking across the burn at twilight, when shadows pool in the grikes and create the illusion of depths that might extend to the center of the earth, one feels watched by presences that predate human arrival in Ireland by eons. Local tradition holds that the Far Darrig favours this landscape particularly, drawn perhaps by its liminal quality, its existence as neither quite solid land nor quite passable terrain. Connemara, that wild region of western Galway, characterised by mountains, lakes, and peat bogs of almost supernatural stillness, accounts for a disproportionate number of documented Far Darrig encounters. The mountains here are not the dramatic peaks of alpine ranges, but rather ancient worn heights that suggest immense age and patient endurance. Between them lie valleys where mist gathers and refuses to dissipate even on the clearest days, where lakes of peaty water reflect the sky in shades of bronze and copper that seem wrong somehow, as if the very chemistry of the water operates according to different laws than those governing the rest of the natural world. The roads that cross Connemara wind between these features, with a seeming randomness that suggests they follow paths far older than any modern engineering, tracks that may have been established by the supernatural inhabitants of the land long before humans arrived. The Aran Islands, those 3 outposts of limestone and determination lying in Galway Bay, represent the absolute edge of the known world in Irish consciousness. Beyond them stretches nothing but the Atlantic, 3,000 miles of open water before the next landfall on the distant shores of North America. The islands themselves are studies in minimalism and harsh beauty, stone walls dividing tiny fields carved from bare rock, communities that have survived for centuries through sheer determination and intimate knowledge of the sea's moods, landscapes where every element has been scoured by wind and salt spray into essential forms that cannot be reduced further. It is on these islands, particularly on Innis Mór, the largest of the 3, that some of the most detailed and disturbing Far Darrig accounts originated. The isolation of the islands, the constant presence of the ocean as reminder of its overwhelming power, the thin soil covering ancient stone. All of these factors create an environment where the supernatural feels not exceptional, but rather as natural and ever-present as the weather. The Dingle Peninsula in County Kerry extends like a gnarled finger pointing into the Atlantic, its spine of mountains running down its length like the vertebrae of some enormous creature turned to stone. The northern coast of the peninsula faces the relative shelter of Dingle Bay, but the southern coast confronts the full fury of the Atlantic without buffer or barrier. Here, the cliffs rise sheer from thrashing water. Sea caves penetrate deep into the rock to emerge in sinkholes miles inland. And the sound of waves echoes through underground chambers in a constant low roar that never quite fades, even at the greatest distance from the shore. The peninsula's western end, marked by Mount Brandon and the scattered remains of early Christian hermitages, represents one of the most spiritually charged locations in Ireland, a place where monks once sought closeness to God through isolation and hardship. But the same qualities that drew holy men to this extreme landscape also attract entities like the Far Darrig, drawn perhaps by the intensity of the place, the way it seems to concentrate spiritual and supernatural energies to an almost unbearable degree. What unites all these locations is not simply their western position or their proximity to the Atlantic, but rather a quality of atmosphere and light that is difficult to articulate but unmistakable to anyone who has spent time in these regions. The air itself feels different here, heavier somehow, laden with moisture and salt, and something else that has no name but makes itself felt as a kind of pressure against the skin. The light, filtered through layers of marine atmosphere and reflecting off water and wet stone, takes on qualities that painters and photographers spend lifetimes trying to capture. Sudden shafts of brilliance breaking through cloud to illuminate a single hillside, while everything around it remains in shadow. The peculiar glow that precedes storms. The way twilight seems to last for hours, extending the liminal period between day and night until it becomes less a transition than a distinct state in its own right. The communities that inhabit these western regions developed particular relationships with the supernatural world, born from their intimate connection to this challenging landscape. These were not people who could afford to dismiss the old stories as mere superstition or relegate them to the realm of entertainment. They lived in places where demonstrated its power and indifference to human comfort on a daily basis, where survival required respect for forces beyond human control, where the thin line between life and death was a constant presence rather than an abstract philosophical concept. In such environments, the supernatural was simply another category of powerful forces that demanded respect and careful navigation. The Far Darrig was not a fairy tale monster, but a genuine danger that required the same serious preparation and caution as storms, dangerous tides, or treacherous bogs. The timing of Far Darrig encounters in these western regions showed clear patterns related to seasonal and meteorological conditions. The autumn and winter months, when Atlantic storms batter the coast with particular violence and darkness claims, the majority of each day saw the highest concentration of reports. The Far Darrig seemed to favour nights when weather made travel dangerous, but not impossible. When someone might have legitimate reason to be on the roads, but would be utterly alone and vulnerable. He appeared most frequently in the hours just after sunset, that dangerous time when those who had travelled to neighbouring villages or towns for market or visiting were making their way home. When darkness had fallen, but the lateness of the hour had not yet driven everyone indoors. These were the moments when the landscape transformed from familiar to alien, when even roads walked hundreds of times before could suddenly seem strange and threatening. Specific locations within these broader regions gained particular notoriety as places where Far Darrig encounters occurred with unsettling frequency. Certain crossroads, certain stretches of road between settlements, certain paths across bogs or through mountain passes. These became known as dangerous places to be avoided after dark, if at all possible. The knowledge was not officially recorded or marked with signs, but rather existed as communal wisdom passed through families and neighbours, the kind of information that everyone who lived in the area simply knew without quite remembering how they learned it. Modern road building and rural electrification have transformed many of these locations, but older residents can still point to sections of modern highways and identify them as places where, in earlier times, one did not linger as darkness fell. The question that haunts every serious examination of Far Darrig folklore is perhaps the most fundamental and troubling one. Why? Why does this entity exist? What purpose do his cruel tests serve? What drives him to seek out human victims and subject them to psychological torments that serve no obvious practical function? These questions have occupied folklorists, cultural historians, and students of Irish mythology for generations, producing a range of interpretations that attempt to make sense of an entity whose motivations remain fundamentally alien to human understanding. The most persistent and compelling explanation, one that appears repeatedly in both academic analysis and traditional Irish interpretation, frames the Far Darrig as a supernatural mechanism for testing and measuring human character, particularly those qualities of courage, composure, and psychological resilience that Irish culture valued as essential survival traits. This character test theory proposes that the Far Darrig serves a function within the supernatural ecosystem, analogous to the role that predators play in natural ecosystems. He culls the weak, identifies those who lack the psychological fortitude necessary to survive in a world where the boundary between human and supernatural realms remains dangerously permeable. From this perspective, his tests are not arbitrary cruelties, but rather systematic evaluations designed to separate those who possess true courage from those who merely present a brave facade, those who can maintain composure under extreme duress from those whose control is superficial and easily shattered. The victims who fail and die or descend into madness are, in this interpretation, casualties of a necessary selection process that strengthens the surviving community by removing those least equipped to handle supernatural encounters. This interpretation gains support from the structure of the tests themselves and the specific qualities they evaluate. The Far Darrig does not test physical strength or intelligence or skill in any conventional sense. His trials specifically target emotional control, the ability to suppress instinctive fear responses, the capacity to maintain composure while witnessing or participating in scenarios that violate every human instinct and cultural prohibition. These are not random qualities, but rather characteristics that would have genuine survival value in a culture that took the supernatural world seriously as a real and present danger. A person who could control their fear response, who could think clearly under psychological pressure, who could follow through on commitments even when every instinct screamed for flight, would be better equipped to survive not just Far Darrig encounters, but any situation requiring mental discipline and emotional regulation. Scholars who study the psychological dimensions of folklore have noted striking parallels between Far Darrig tests and certain rites of passage found in cultures worldwide. Many traditional societies subject adolescents or initiates to ordeals designed to test courage and composure under conditions of extreme stress. These trials often involve elements designed to provoke terror, isolation in dangerous places, confrontation with death or dead bodies, participation in scenarios that violate normal social rules, and taboos. The purpose is not cruelty for its own sake, but rather transformation, the creation of adults who have proven their ability to function effectively, even when overwhelmed by fear or disgust. The Far Darrig's tests, viewed through this lens, represent a supernatural version of such initiatory ordeals. Trials that transform those who pass them from ordinary individuals into people who have demonstrated extraordinary psychological resilience. But the character test theory extends beyond simple evaluation of courage to encompass more subtle qualities of judgment and wisdom. The survivors of Far Darrig encounters often emphasize that success required recognizing of the test itself, understanding that they were being evaluated rather than genuinely commanded to commit atrocities. This meta-awareness, the ability to maintain enough psychological distance from the horror to recognize its constructed side, represents a sophisticated form of intelligence that combines emotional control with analytical thinking. The Far Darrig, in this interpretation, tests not just raw courage, but the ability to think clearly while experiencing terror, to maintain enough cognitive function under extreme stress, to recognize patterns and make sound judgments about the reality itself. The moral complexity of the test also suggests evaluation of character in deeper and more nuanced ways than simple measurement of bravery. Those who encounter the Far Darrig face impossible ethical dilemmas, follow commands that seem to demand participation in evil, or refuse and face certain death. The correct response, according to the survival accounts, involves recognizing that the ethical dilemma itself is part of the illusion, that the apparent choice between committing atrocity and dying is a false dichotomy, designed to provoke exactly the kind of moral anguish that reveals character. Those who maintain composure by understanding, consciously or unconsciously, that the scenario is not real demonstrate a kind of moral flexibility that values survival and clear thinking over rigid adherence to principles that may not apply in supernatural contexts. This aspect of the tests has generated considerable debate among those who study Irish folklore and ethics. Some interpreters argue that the Far Darrig teaches dangerous lessons about moral relativism, suggesting that principles can be abandoned when the stakes are high enough. Others counter that the tests actually reinforce the importance of distinguishing between genuine ethical situations and manipulative illusions, between real harm and constructed scenarios. The ability to make that distinction, to recognize when one is being manipulated and respond accordingly, represents a form of moral intelligence that has obvious survival value in any context, where powerful entities might attempt to exploit human moral commitments for their own purposes. The character test theory also addresses the question of why the Far Darrig's punishments for failure are so severe and lasting. If the tests serve a genuine evaluative function, identifying those who lack necessary psychological qualities, then the permanence of the consequences makes sense as a way of removing the unfit from the population in a lasting manner. The victims who die, go mad, or suffer under curses become warnings to others, their fate serving as powerful motivation for developing the emotional control and mental discipline that might prevent similar outcomes. In this interpretation, the Far Darrig's cruelty is not gratuitous, but functional, each punishment serving the dual purpose of eliminating the unfit and educating the survivors about the absolute necessity of maintaining composure when confronting the supernatural. Critics of the character test theory point out that it seems to rationalize and justify what is, by any human standard, monstrous behavior. The Far Darrig inflicts terrible suffering on individuals who may be entirely decent people, lacking only in one specific set of psychological skills. The theory, these critics argue, imports too much purpose and meaning into what may simply be the actions of a malevolent entity that enjoys causing suffering. The fact that humans can extract lessons and meaning from these encounters does not necessarily mean that teaching those lessons is the entity's actual motivation. The Far Darrig may simply be cruel, and the character test interpretation may be a human attempt to find meaning and purpose in suffering that is actually arbitrary and meaningless. Yet the persistence of the character test interpretation across centuries and across different communities within Ireland suggests that it serves important cultural functions regardless of whether it accurately describes the Far Darrig's actual motivations. By framing encounters as tests rather than random acts of cruelty, Irish tradition transforms terrifying experiences into meaningful ones. Victims who pass the tests could understand their suffering as serving a purpose, as proving something important about their character and courage. Communities could use the stories to teach essential lessons about emotional control and mental discipline. The framework of testing and evaluation provided a way to think about and prepare for supernatural encounters that was more psychologically manageable than simply accepting that one might at any moment fall victim to arbitrary supernatural malevolence. The character test theory ultimately reveals as much about Irish cultural values as it does about the Far Darrig himself. A culture that develops such elaborate frameworks for understanding supernatural encounters as tests of character is a culture that values courage, composure, and psychological resilience above almost all other qualities. It is a culture that understands emotional control, not as suppression of feelings, but as a life-saving skill that sees the ability to maintain composure under extreme duress as perhaps the most important characteristic a person can develop. The Far Darrig, whether intentionally or not, serves as the ultimate evaluator of these qualities, the being whose tests are so extreme that only those with truly exceptional psychological fortitude can hope to pass them. The transition from oral tradition to written documentation represents a crucial moment in the preservation of any folklore, a point where stories that might otherwise vanish with the deaths of their tellers become fixed in permanent form for future generations to study and analyse. In Ireland, this transition occurred primarily during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when systematic efforts to collect and preserve traditional knowledge reached their height. The Irish Folklore Commission, established in 1935, undertook the monumental task of recording the oral traditions of rural Ireland before modernisation and emigration could erase them entirely. Among the thousands upon thousands of accounts collected by commission field workers, Far Darrig encounters occupy a special category. Testimonies given with such gravity and conviction that the collectors themselves often noted their inability to dismiss them as mere entertainment or creative fiction. The methodology employed by folklore collectors of this era deserves attention, as it speaks to the seriousness with which these accounts were treated and recorded. Field workers, often native Irish speakers with deep connections to the communities they documented, would spend days or weeks in specific localities, earning the trust of informants who might be reluctant to share stories with outsiders. The interviews were conducted in Irish when possible, preserving the exact phrasing and terminology of the original accounts rather than translating them into potentially distorting English equivalents. Notes recorded not just the content of stories, but also the circumstances of their telling, the informant's demeanor, their emotional state while recounting the experience, the reactions of other community members present during the interview, any physical evidence or corroborating testimony that supported the account. One particularly well-documented case comes from the village of Carna in Connemara, recorded in 1937 by a collector named Seamus O. Dwy Learga. The informant was a woman named Mary ni Chwalain, 73 years old at the time of the interview, who recounted an encounter her father had experienced as a young man in the 1860s. The level of detail preserved in this account is extraordinary, including not just the events of the encounter, but also the specific location where it occurred, the time of year, the weather conditions, and most significantly, the lasting effects the experience had on Mair's father throughout his long life. He had been walking home from a wedding celebration in a neighbouring village when he encountered the Far Darrig at a crossroads known locally as An Crosair Rua, the Red Crossroads, a name that predated his encounter and suggested a long association with the entity. The Far Darrig commanded Mair's father to accompany him to a nearby rath, one of the ancient circular earthworks that dot the Irish landscape, remnants of Iron Age settlements that folklore identifies as entrances to the fairy realm. Inside the rath, the young man was forced to witness what appeared to be a gathering of the dead, figures that seemed to recognize him and call to him by name, attempting to draw him into their company. The psychological pressure of this scene, the terror of seeing people he had known in life apparently returned from death and beckoning him to join them, pushed him to the absolute edge of his composure. He maintained his silence and his neutral expression throughout, but Mair reported that her father never fully recovered from the experience. He refused to walk past that particular rath ever again, taking miles-long detours to avoid even coming within sight of it, and he suffered from nightmares about the encounter until his death decades later. What makes this account particularly valuable is the collector's notation that multiple other residents of Carna confirmed knowing Mair's father and observing the changes in his behaviour following the night in question. They corroborated that he had indeed taken extreme measures to avoid the wrath, that his fear of the location was genuine and lasting, and that he had spoken of the encounter only rarely and with visible distress. This kind of corroboration, while not proving the supernatural of the event, establishes that something profoundly disturbing occurred that night, something that left permanent psychological marks on a man who had previously been known for his courage and good humour. Another extensively documented case appears in the Folklore archives from County Clare, collected in 1942 from a fisherman named Thomas mac Conmara. Thomas himself claimed to have encountered the Far Darrig not once, but twice in his life, surviving both encounters through strict adherence to the rules passed down through his family. The first encounter occurred when he was a young man of 20, walking home late from the market town of Ennis. The Far Darrig appeared on the road ahead of him and commanded him to enter a nearby churchyard and dig at a specific grave. Thomas followed the instructions exactly, maintaining perfect composure, even as he excavated through several feet of earth. Just as his spade was about to strike the coffin, the Far Darrig called a halt to the test and allowed him to leave, acknowledging his success in maintaining control throughout the ordeal. The second encounter came 15 years later, when Thomas was a husband and father with a reputation as one of the steadiest and most reliable men in his community. This time, the Far Darrig tested him with the cooking pot scenario, presenting what appeared to be a child's body, and commanding him to prepare it for cooking. Thomas recognized the test immediately, having survived the first encounter, and having spent years mentally preparing for the possibility of another. He followed the commands without hesitation, and, as before, the illusion dissolved at the crucial moment, revealing itself as nothing more than cloth and straw. The collector noted that Thomas spoke of these encounters without embellishment or dramatic emphasis, relating them in the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to describe a difficult day's fishing or a close call at sea. The archives contain numerous accounts from individuals who did not survive Far Darrig encounters intact, testimonies given by family members or community witnesses who observed the aftermath of failed tests. A particularly harrowing account from County Mayo describes a young woman who encountered the Far Darrig while returning from visiting a sick relative. She apparently showed fear or refused a command, and from that night forward, she fell into a state that her family could only describe as living death. She remained physically present, eating when fed, and responding to simple instructions, but her mind seemed trapped elsewhere, her eyes focused on scenes that no one else could see, her lips occasionally moving in silent conversation with invisible presences. She lived in this state for 7 years before dying of pneumonia, never once showing any sign of returning to full consciousness or awareness of her actual surroundings. What emerges from systematic examination of these recorded accounts is a remarkable consistency in the core elements despite variations in specific details and local circumstances. The Far Darrig is always described as small in stature, always dressed in red garments, always appearing at liminal times and places. His tests always involve scenarios designed to provoke maximum psychological horror while maintaining the structure of a trial that can theoretically be passed through composure alone. The consequences of failure always fall into the same categories: sudden death, permanent madness, or lasting curses that manifest as physical ailments or cascading misfortunes. This consistency across different time periods, different regions, and different informants suggests either a genuine phenomenon being observed and reported with accuracy, or a cultural archetype so deeply embedded in Irish consciousness that it manifests uniformly across the entire society. The collectors themselves often included personal observations about the credibility of their informants and the cultural context surrounding these accounts. Many noted that the people who shared Far Darrig's stories were otherwise rational, practical individuals who showed no signs of delusion or excessive credulity in other matters. These were farmers and fishermen, shopkeepers and craftspeople, individuals whose daily lives required sound judgment and clear thinking. The fact that such people would recount supernatural encounters with complete conviction, often with visible emotion and residual fear despite decades having passed since the events, suggested to many collectors that dismissing the accounts as simple superstition or entertainment would be both disrespectful and intellectually dishonest. The archival records also preserve the social and cultural context that gave these stories their power and relevance. The accounts come from communities where the supernatural world was integrated into daily life and decision-making, where consulting the old knowledge before making major choices was as natural as checking the weather forecast. These were societies where belief in the reality of fairy encounters was not considered irrational, but rather represented practical wisdom accumulated over generations. The Far Darrig was not a monster from scary stories, but a genuine danger that required the same serious preparation and respect as any other threat to life and sanity. The modern world, with its electric lights that banish darkness and its technologies that seem to explain every mystery, creates the illusion that we have moved beyond the age of supernatural encounters. The lonely roads where the Far Darrig once walked are now illuminated by street lamps and travelled by automobiles that can cover in minutes distances that once required hours of vulnerable walking through darkness. The cemeteries where victims were forced to dig up graves are now maintained by municipal workers and secured with gates that lock at sunset. The isolated cottages where cooking pot tests unfolded have been replaced by modern homes with deadbolts and security systems. Yet despite all these transformations, despite the seemingly complete triumph of rationality and technology over superstition and fear, the Far Darrig endures in Irish consciousness with a persistence that suggests he represents something more fundamental and less easily dismissed than simple folklore or cultural artifact. The question of why this particular entity maintains such a powerful hold on the imagination, why his stories continue to disturb and fascinate even those who claim no belief in the supernatural, points toward truths about human psychology and the of fear itself. The Far Darrig's tests target aspects of the human experience that remain constant regardless of technological advancement or cultural change. The fear of death and what lies beyond it, the terror of witnessing the violation of boundaries that should remain inviolate, the psychological pressure of being commanded to participate in acts that contradict our deepest moral principles. These are not concerns that modernization has resolved or rendered obsolete. They are fundamental aspects of human consciousness that persist beneath whatever veneer of civilization we construct over them. The Far Darrig speaks to these enduring fears with a directness and intensity that few other folkloric entities can match. The character traits he tests, courage and composure, and the ability to maintain psychological control under extreme duress, remain as valuable in the contemporary world as they were in rural Ireland centuries ago. The specific scenarios may have changed. The tests we face may involve psychological pressures different from those imposed by the Red Man, but the fundamental requirement for emotional regulation and mental discipline persists. Modern life presents its own versions of impossible situations, moments when we must choose between conflicting imperatives, when we must maintain composure while confronting horrors that threaten to overwhelm our capacity for rational thought. The Far Darrig's tests, stripped of their supernatural trappings, reveal themselves as extreme versions of challenges that all humans face in various forms throughout their lives. The endurance of Far Darrig folklore also speaks to something deeper about how humans process and preserve cultural knowledge about psychological resilience. The stories function as a kind of mental training, preparing listeners for the reality that life will sometimes present situations that seem psychologically unbearable, that the ability to maintain composure in such moments can literally mean the difference between survival and destruction. By framing these lessons in supernatural terms, by making them stories about encounters with otherworldly entities, rather than abstract discussions of psychology, Irish tradition ensured that the knowledge would be memorable, would carry emotional weight, would be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as mere theoretical speculation. The Far Darrig is frightening precisely because he needs to be frightening for the lessons he teaches to be effective. In contemporary Ireland, the Far Darrig occupies an interesting position in the cultural landscape. Most urban Irish people, when asked about the Red Man, will recognise the name and have some general knowledge of his as a dangerous trickster fairy. Many will know someone, usually an older relative from rural areas, who claims to have had a genuine encounter or who grew up in a community where such encounters were treated as real possibilities. There is often a kind of dual consciousness at work. An intellectual acknowledgement that fairy encounters belong to a pre-modern worldview that has been superseded by scientific understanding, combined with an emotional reluctance to completely dismiss the stories as mere fiction. This ambivalence itself reveals something important about how folklore continues to function, even in societies that consider themselves thoroughly rationalized and secularized. The Far Darrig has also found new life in contemporary Irish literature, film, and other creative works, though often in forms that transform or reinterpret the original folklore in significant ways. Some creators treat him as a symbol of Ireland's harsh history, the personification of the psychological tests that poverty, famine, and colonial oppression imposed on the Irish people across centuries. Others see him as a representation of moral ambiguity, an entity who forces examination of what we truly believe versus what we merely claim to believe when comfortable and safe. Still, others approach him as a psychological archetype, a manifestation of the inner tests we impose on ourselves. The cruel voice that demands we prove our worth through ordeals that seem designed to break us. These reinterpretations, while departing from the traditional folklore in various ways, demonstrate the continuing power of the Far Darrig as a concept that speaks to fundamental human experiences and anxieties. What the Far Darrig ultimately represents, across all his various manifestations and interpretations, is the recognition that the universe contains forces indifferent to human comfort, and that survival sometimes requires qualities that go beyond simple physical strength or intellectual ability. He embodies the understanding that psychological resilience, the capacity to maintain composure and clear thinking under extreme duress, is not merely a virtue but a literal survival skill. He reminds us that there are tests in life that cannot be avoided or negotiated, moments when our only choices are to maintain control or be destroyed by our own fear responses. These lessons, harsh and uncompromising as they are, reflect genuine wisdom accumulated over generations of people who lived lives where such tests were not theoretical possibilities, but regular occurrences. The shadow the Far Darrig casts extends beyond individual encounters or specific cultural contexts to touch something universal about the human condition. We all face moments when we must choose between giving into fear and maintaining our composure, when we must decide whether to let psychological pressure break us or to find within ourselves reserves of strength we did not know we possessed. We all encounter situations that seem designed to reveal our true character, to separate our performed selves from our authentic cause. The Far Darrig simply makes these tests explicit and extreme, stripping away all the ambiguity and complexity that usually surrounds such moments and presenting the choice in its starkest possible form. Control your fear or be destroyed by it. As we conclude this exploration of one of Irish folklore's most disturbing and fascinating entities, we return to the fundamental question of why these stories matter, why they deserve preservation and serious study rather than dismissal as primitive superstition. The answer lies in recognizing that folklore is not merely entertainment or cultural artifact, but rather a repository of psychological wisdom accumulated over generations. The Far Darrig stories teach lessons about fear, courage, composure, and the psychological resilience that remain relevant regardless of how much the external world changes. They remind us that humans have always faced situations that test them to their limits, that the ability to maintain control under extreme pressure has always been a crucial survival skill, that understanding our own psychological vulnerabilities and developing strategies to manage them is work that every generation must undertake anew. If this journey into the shadowed corners of Irish folklore has resonated with you, if you want to continue exploring the entities and stories that our ancestors used to make sense of fear and teach essential lessons about survival, consider subscribing to Echoes of the Old World. We will continue to pull back the veil on folklore's most dangerous and misunderstood beings, to examine the cultural wisdom preserved in stories that many dismiss too quickly as mere superstition. The Far Darrig still walks the liminal spaces of consciousness and culture, still tests those brave enough to confront him, still teaches the harsh lesson that composure and courage are not optional luxuries, but essential requirements for navigating a world that contains forces far older and more powerful than human civilization. His shadow stretches across centuries, and as long as humans face tests that threaten to break their psychological defenses, his stories will continue to speak truth about the fear and the necessity of facing it with unwavering composure.